Imagine if 9/11 ended US imperialism. Imagine if Ted Kaczynski kicked off the second wave of Luddites. Imagine if John Hinckley Jr. didn't miss. This is the story of the Animal Liberation Front, the most successful terrorists in history.
Give me a name and address now, I'll arrest you.
Welcome to Insidious Albion, a show about the monstrosities, atrocities and conspiracies that shake this green and pleasant land.
Today's subjects: firebombed pharmaceutical labs, exhumed corpses, tried to assassinate Margaret Thatcher, all in pursuit of a singular mission: the liberation of all living creatures. Their crusade ended fox hunting, killed the fur trade, and shut down Europe's largest animal testing facility. They took the animal rights movement global and permanently reshaped our relationship to the living world. In response, the British government fundamentally reimagined the purpose and function of policing. Just as Vietnam was a testing ground for a new type of warfare, the battle against the animal rights movement was where the UK government perfected new methods of public control. It began on a field in Devon. The British have a love of animals that borders on deranged. During the evacuation of Kabul, we airlifted 150 cats and dogs out of the Afghan capital.
Did you authorize evacuating animals out of Kabul over?
No, that is absolutely. This whole thing is total rhubarb.
In Essex, there's a bench memorialising 4 swans killed in a catapult attack. And our former Prime Minister once had sex with a pig's head. But there's one exception to this rule: the foxhound. Once England's national sport, the aristocratic hobby of watching dogs eviscerate foxes began in the late 18th century when the upper classes ran out of deer to kill. It's a ritual act of violence that bonds the ruling class. Well, one of them anyway. In the early 60s, proto-hippies in Devonshire formed the Hunt Saboteurs Association, a vigilante group that ruined hunts through ingenious but strictly legal means. But they faced an enemy with no compulsion to act within the law.
As usual, the Sabs have a few honourable bumps and bruises. On other occasions, many hunt saboteurs have ended up in hospital. Yeah. The Sabs have also had one of their frequent brushes with the law.
The hunters had full support of the press and politicians who saw the Sabs the vanguard in a class war. So by the late 60s, the movement had been pushed back to the margins.
It'll take more than aerosols and horn-blowing to put a stop to fox hunting.
Then, in 1973, a chemical lab exploded in Milton Keynes.
The future of the animal rights movement would be defined by a teenager from Luton who packed in his law degree to join the fight. But he soon became disillusioned by the Hunt Saboteurs' strict adherence to legal methods. And so he formed a splinter cell, one that wouldn't be confined by the law. They would be the Malcolm X to the Hunt Sab's Martin Luther King. He called the group the Animal Liberation Front. His name was
Ronnie Lee, a former Hunt saboteur. He's unrepentant about the organisation's illegal activities.
People have been protesting for well over 100 years, that I think people felt driven to do something more direct.
The ALF announced their arrival when they firebombed a facility testing the effects of radiation on dogs. Just as Ronnie had predicted, a new movement starts to build, one the establishment doesn't quite know how to deal with.
It's very odd seeing anarchists who shout very loud and sound very aggressive.
Calling us anarchists, I mean, that's just like an old stereotype.
There's a big anarchist flag behind you on the wall.
Animal Liberation Front.
From a hardcore of half a dozen activists, the ALF now claims some 1,300 members. Activists by the hundred have stormed some of the country's largest establishments.
At the dawn of the 80s, Boots had backed away from animal testing. The first cruelty charges had been brought against the testing lab, and 75% of the country was in favour of banning fox hunting. Emboldened and ambitious, the ALF looked for a new, even bigger target.
Officially, Porton Down is the UK's leading research campus, ensuring the British public benefits from the latest developments in science and technology. In reality, it's a military black site and a playground for the sickest, most deranged nerds this country has ever produced.
A team had been set up at Porton. Their work was necessarily the development of practical weapons, which had finally to be tested with actual infectious agents.
During the Cold War, the UK government gave scientists at Porton Down a license to follow whatever sadistic, psychotic or surreal hunches they had, so long as it protected us from the Red Threat. At the Armoured Research Lab, they blew up sheep with mortars, drained the blood from pigs, tear-gassed dogs to death. They even had their own farm to breed animals. This is where the British government tested the effects of psychedelic drugs on soldiers. Boffins were given such unlimited freedom, they were allowed to drop anthrax on a desolate Scottish island.
Sheep were used for the trials because they're particularly sensitive to inhaled anthrax.
And they didn't stop at just animals and Scottish islands.
Documents now declassified in the National Archives revealed that the public was sprayed with chemical compounds and bacteria throughout the West Country.
But at the start of the 80s, a series of leaks and legal disclosures put Porton Down on the radar of the animal rights movement. As a result, in 1982, 6,000 members of various animal rights groups marched 8 miles to Porton Down. They burned effigies and played the sounds of screaming animals before 1,500 of the bravest or dimmest activists tried to storm the gates. This led to chaotic scenes of dogs being set loose on animal rights protesters and the army trying to subdue hundreds of enraged crusties. This marked a turning point for the animal rights movement. What began as a humble protest against a harmless Tory blood sport had evolved into an international revolutionary force aimed squarely at the apparatus of the state. And then, a completely predictable and not at all strange thing happened. Faced with the rising tide of public support for the animal rights movement, Margaret Thatcher launched a three-pronged assault on the ALF and civil liberties at large. The Met set up the Animal Rights National Index, an anodyne-sounding unit giving broad powers to surveil activists in any field. In Whitehall, she revived the long-dormant Interdepartmental Group on Subversion in Public Life, which brought together MI5, the police, and government agencies to root out dissidents among their ranks. Finally, she ripped up the rulebook on sentencing and ordered the boys in blue to bring the hammer down on the Animal Liberation Front. Ronnie Lee was the first victim, sentenced to an unprecedented 10 years in jail for the misdemeanor charge of criminal damage. Maggie was sending a message. The rules of the game had changed.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth.
Maggie's crackdown coincided with an influx of new members to the ALF and other left-wing protest groups. Among them was Bob Robinson, who threw himself into the work of the Animal Liberation Front. Within months, he recruited 2 comrades for an audacious operation.
The Animal Liberation Front's claims over this attack are the latest in a series of hardline moves against a variety of targets. Attacks which have escalated from paint daubing to firebomb attacks.
Soon after Margaret Thatcher supercharged the policing of the animal rights movement, a series of uncharacteristically violent and sophisticated acts were carried out by groups claiming to be affiliated with the ALS. 2 bombs were placed on the cars of Porton Down scientists using plastic explosives and mercury tilt switches. Miraculously, both the researchers survived. 13-month-old toddler passing by wasn't so lucky.
When you seriously injure a 13-month-old baby, you repel a large proportion of the people.
I do not accept for one second that I was the work of the Animal Liberation Front. There is such a thing in this country as the dirty tricks department.
Police traced the plastic explosive used back to the Territorial Army. Years later, they admitted that they had been tipped off about the attacks, but failed to act in time.
Where there is error, may we bring truth.
At the height of the ALF's popularity and success, the actions of a new cohort of animal rights activists threatened to discredit the whole movement and roll back the success of the last 30 years. Curious.
The Animal Liberation Front.
In 1988, 2 of Bob Robinson's accomplices were nicked in dawn raids at their bedsits. Bob Robinson miraculously escaped. He fled to Spain, leaving behind his girlfriend who he'd met in the Animal Liberation Front and their newborn child. They weren't the only ones that Bob had left in the ship when he jumped ship. Early on in his days in the ALF, he'd co-authored a pamphlet with his friend Helen Steele.
It was this leaflet that prompted McDonald's to bring the libel action. It accused the corporation of being responsible for starvation in the Third World, destroying vast areas of Central American rainforest, as well as cruelty to animals.
While Helen was battling Ronald and co., she was also 2 years into the hunt for her boyfriend, John Barker, who had disappeared without a trace. It was Bob Robinson who had introduced John to Helen, and now both men had simply vanished.
Something one day made me start looking through the death records, and what I found at that point was that John had actually been using the identity of a child who'd died aged 8 years old.
Helen didn't realise it yet, but she'd snagged a thread that would unravel one of the biggest conspiracies in British history. It would reveal not only that the government and police had infiltrated and sabotaged left-wing groups for decades, but the widespread tactic of seducing and even impregnating young activists in order to provide cover for these spy cops. If you hadn't worked it out yet, Bob Robinson was not Bob Robinson's real name. Bob Robinson was really Special Branch Officer Robert Lambert, OBE. He was a bit like James Bond. If all of 007's enemies wanted to save the world rather than destroy it, and none of them could afford a car. Helen's boyfriend, whose real name was John Dines, was Robert Lambert's protege in the Met, and had copied his method down to a T. Lambert and Dines were just two of a whole host of people who were surveilling Helen Steele. The 3 different spy cops would infiltrate her life. The Met had a whole team on her, reporting back to MI5. All of them were selling that information to McDonald's, who had 2 separate teams of private investigators trying to dig up dirt on her. All of this, by the way, is for the crime of writing a pamphlet with an undercover cop, criticising a certain multinational family-friendly restaurant chain. Something was going haywire in Britain's security state. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Troubles, and with 9/11 just a twinkle in Dick Cheney's eye, the intelligence agencies went to war with the police to see who could crack down hardest on left-wing activists. As a result, by 1997, 300 activists in the ALF had been imprisoned, and scores of others were abandoning the movement for their own safety. But there was hope on the horizon. A smooth-talking axeman with 2 top buttons undone was being swept into power, promising a new era for animal rights. And if you listened closely enough, you could hear the sound of a new, modern, compassionate Albion. You could hear the sound of a cool Britannia. In order to understand the current state of Britain, why you can be arrested for having a coconut placard, why Keir Starmer can criminalise Palestine action, we need to understand what Cheeky Tony did once he got his trotters through the door of number 10 Downing Street. New Labour came to power making a lot of big promises to the animal rights movement, including mandatory lab inspections, a committee on vivisection, and a free vote on fox hunting. Instead, before him and Sherry could send out their first Christmas card, he began radically overhauling the security state, building on the blueprint Thatcher had drawn up when she went to war with the Animal Liberation Front. The intelligence techniques and legal frameworks that were developed to fight the animal rights movement has expanded to create the entire system of social control that we live under today. This is how it worked. Margaret Thatcher's Animal Rights National Index and its massive database of activists was absorbed into the Association of Chief Police Officers alongside the National Extremism Tactical Coordination Unit, which was staffed by SDS officers who'd cut their teeth battling the ALF. The Association of Chief Police Officers was somehow privatised, allowing it to work with private intelligence services such as Global Open, which was founded by the former head of the Animal National Rights Index, who employed Robert Lambert protege and fellow undercover rapist Mark Kennedy. Tony now had his new goon squad, and he armed them with a raft of new legislation that made anyone who defied his rule a fair target. In short succession, we got the Police Act of 97, the Crime and Disorder Act of 98, then we had ASBOs, and finally, the pièce de résistance, the Terrorism Act. To justify this avalanche of new draconian legislation, Tony summoned the spectre of the domestic extremist, which would be expanded to include anyone who opposed racism, prison conditions, public corruption, private corruption, parking laws, asylum laws, climate change, and of course, the animal rights movement.
Betrayed by Blair and surrounded by his pigs, rats and moles, the animal rights movement desperately needed a new hero, and they found one in a man called Barry Horn.
Barry Horn! Barry Horn, I think!
Not that one. This one.
Barry Horn, seen here on the right, became well known to police during years of militant activism. Last month, in Full Sutton Prison in York, he began refusing food. The government said today it won't let policy be dictated by blackmailers. The rather awkward fact is that Barry Horn's demand for a royal commission is not one of the outrageous excesses of animal rights extremism. In fact, the government itself promised one, before it came into government, that is.
Barry Horn's series of hunger strikes inspired a wave of new activism around the globe. And when he began his fourth hunger strike in 2001, hardcore activists drew up a hit list of people they would get revenge against should he become a martyr for their cause. Barry Horn died in October 2001, succumbing to organ failure as a result of his hunger strikes. Thousands attended his funeral, but to the wider world it barely registered. 9/11 had blown the animal rights movement off the political map. Luckily for Tony Blair, it had gifted him a massive apparatus of surveillance and social control that he could now turn against the Muslim community. And by the time he left office, there were 0 instances of animal rights extremism in the UK. But they left behind a changed world. Tony did eventually ban fox hunting, one of their many fringe opinions that had become common sense. Without the Animal Liberation Front, there would be no free-range eggs or cruelty-free products. SeaWorld would still have orcas, and the circus would still have lions. They stood up for something, and by many metrics they won. But it came at a cost that those hippies on that field in Devon could never have imagined.